The morning of September 19th, 1944, broke cold and gray over the rolling farmland east of Haraucourt, France. Hauptmann Werner Schroeder stood beside the hull of a Panther tank that would never move again, its final drive seized solid, smoke still rising from the engine compartment where oil had burned through the night. Behind him, stretching back along the narrow farm road, 5 more Panthers sat disabled in various states of mechanical failure. One had thrown a track. Another had suffered a catastrophic transmission failure just 3 kilometers from the railhead. The rest had simply stopped, their engines overheated, their drive systems destroyed by the strain of moving 45 tons of steel across French roads without proper break-in time. Schroeder was not a tank commander. He was a maintenance officer with the 113th Panzer Brigade, and in the chaos of the German counteroffensive now underway, he had become something else entirely. The man responsible for 6 broken Panthers that stood directly in the path of what his commander believed would be an American breakthrough. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The strategic situation was clear enough, even to a mechanic. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army had launched its counterattack the day before, aiming to recapture Lunéville and destroy the American bridgehead over the Moselle River. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, equipped with brand-new Panther tanks fresh from the factory, were supposed to shatter Combat Command A of the American 4th Armored Division. The Germans had local superiority in numbers. They had the most advanced medium tank in the world. They had momentum. What they did not have was reliability. Schroeder had watched the Panthers arrive at the railhead near Metz just days earlier, their Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste still fresh, their long 75mm guns gleaming. He had read the delivery reports with growing alarm. These tanks had not completed their break-in period. The factory workers in Germany, desperate to meet production quotas under Allied bombing, had rushed the final assembly. The crews assigned to these vehicles had trained together for less than 2 weeks. And now, in the opening hours of the most important German counteroffensive in the West since Normandy, the mechanical defects that should have been corrected in training were revealing themselves at the worst possible moment. The Panther had been designed as Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34, a tank that combined sloped armor, mobility, and firepower in ways that had shocked German commanders on the Eastern Front. The Panther was meant to be better in every way. Its frontal armor, sloped at 55 degrees, could defeat almost any Allied anti-tank gun at combat ranges. Its long 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate a Sherman tank's armor from 2,000 meters. On paper, it was invincible. In practice, it was a mechanical nightmare. The early production Panthers that had been rushed into combat at Kursk in July 1943 had suffered catastrophic failure rates. Of the 200 Panthers that began that offensive, only 40 remained operational after 2 days. Most lost not to enemy fire, but to engine fires, transmission failures, and broken final drives. The factory had made improvements since then. By late 1944, the Panther Ausf-G model incorporated fixes to many of the earlier problems. Reliability had improved dramatically on the Eastern Front, where experienced crews who understood the vehicle's limitations could nurse it through combat. But these Panthers arriving in France were not in the hands of experienced crews. They were crewed by boys pulled from training schools, commanded by officers who had never worked together, supported by a logistics system that was collapsing under Allied air attacks. And they were being thrown immediately into a major offensive without the careful break-in procedures that the Maybach HL-230 engine required. Schroeder had tried to explain this to Oberst Hans von Heydebreck, the brigade commander, when the orders came to move out. The Panthers needed at least 50 kilometers of road marches at varying speeds to properly seat the piston rings and allow the transmission components to wear in correctly. They needed time for the crews to learn the idiosyncrasies of their individual vehicles. They needed, above all, careful attention to engine temperature, because the Maybach was prone to overheating if pushed too hard before proper break-in. Von Heidebrecht had listened with the patience of a man who had no time for patience. "The offensive begins tomorrow, Hauptmann. Your concerns are noted. Now make the Panthers ready to fight." So Schroeder had made them ready, and one by one they had broken. The first Panther threw a track just to 2 kilometers into the approach march, its drive sprocket damaged by improper tension. The second suffered an engine fire when a fuel line, improperly secured at the factory, vibrated loose and sprayed gasoline onto the hot exhaust manifold. The third made it almost to the line of departure before its transmission began making a grinding sound that Schroeder recognized immediately. The final drive was failing, the gears eating themselves under the tremendous torque of combat acceleration. By dawn on September 19th, Schroeder had 6 disabled Panthers scattered along a farm road that, according to the map, ran directly through what American intelligence would call a vulnerable sector in their defensive line. The main body of the 113th Panzer Brigade had bypassed these casualties and pushed forward into the attack. The sounds of that battle could be heard clearly from where Schroeder stood. The distinctive crack of Panther 75mm guns, the deeper boom of American artillery, the stuttering chatter of machine gun fire. And then, around mid-morning, the sound changed. Schroeder heard it before he saw it. The higher-pitched crack of American 75mm guns, the particular sound of Sherman tanks firing on the move. The noise was coming not from ahead, where the German attack was supposed to be pushing the Americans back, but from the north, where the American 4th Armored Division's reserve units were positioned. A motorcycle courier appeared, sliding his BMW R75 to a halt in the mud beside Schroeder's command vehicle. The young man's face was gray with exhaustion and fear. "Hauptmann, Oberst von Heidebrecht's compliments. The Americans are counterattacking in strength from the north. He believes they will attempt to cut our supply lines by advancing down this road." The courier gestured at the farm track where the 6 Panthers sat disabled. "You are ordered to hold this position at all costs. Reinforcements will arrive when available." Schroeder looked at the courier, then at the 6 broken Panthers, then back at the courier. "With what am I supposed to hold exactly? I have 23 men, mostly mechanics, 6 tanks that cannot move, no infantry support, no anti-tank guns." The courier's expression suggested he had delivered similar orders to similar men all morning. "The Oberst says you will find a way. Heil Hitler!" He kick-started his motorcycle and roared off before Schroeder could formulate a response that would not constitute defeatism punishable under military law. Schroeder gathered his men, 19 mechanics, 2 radio operators, 1 medic, and 1 very young lieutenant named Friedhelm, who had arrived with the Panthers as a liaison officer, and who now looked at Schroeder with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. They stood in a rough semicircle between the disabled tanks, while Schroeder explained their situation with the brutal honesty that men facing death deserve. "We have 6 Panthers that cannot move," he said. "We have small arms, a few Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons meant for the tank's crews, and whatever ammunition we can salvage from the disabled vehicles. The Americans are coming down this road, and we are ordered to stop them." One of the older mechanics, a Gefreiter named Klaus, who had survived 3 years in Russia, spat in the mud. "So we die here for tanks that the factory couldn't be bothered to build properly." "Perhaps," Schroeder said. "Or perhaps we make the Americans believe these tanks are more dangerous than they actually are." He walked out to the nearest Panther, the one whose final drive had failed. Its turret still traversed manually. Its gun was operational. It simply could not move. Schroeder climbed onto the engine deck and looked down the road, studying the terrain with an engineer's eye. The farm road ran through a shallow valley, with gentle slopes on either side rising perhaps 10 meters above the road surface. Woods lined the eastern slope, providing concealment. The road itself was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. Stone walls, typical of French farmland, bordered the road at intervals. An idea began to form. "We cannot move the Panthers," Schroeder said, climbing down. "But we can move them once, with winches and cables. We can position them to create a roadblock that any American advance will have to deal with. And if they believe these Panthers are operational combat vehicles rather than disabled wrecks, they will have to treat them as serious threats." Lieutenant Friedhelm's face brightened with something approaching hope. "A deception?" "A necessity," Schroeder corrected. "Klaus, gather every tow cable we have. We're going to drag these Panthers into position. I want 2 of them directly on the road, angled to cover the northern approach. I want 2 more on the eastern slope, hold-down positions if we can manage it, covering the flank. The last 2 will position as a reserve line, 200 meters back." "They cannot shoot if they're out of fuel," Klaus pointed out. "Then we make sure the 2 on the road have full fuel tanks. We siphon from the others if necessary. Those 2 Panthers will be operational in every way except mobility. Their guns work. Their optics work. If the Americans come down this road, they'll face 2 Panther 75mm guns at close range." One of the younger mechanics raised his hand hesitantly. "Hauptmann, what about the turret traverse on the ones without fuel? The hydraulics won't work." Schroeder had already thought of this. "We traverse them manually into position to cover likely avenues of approach. Once they're set, they don't need to move. The Americans won't know they can't traverse. All they'll see is a Panther gun pointed at them." For the next 3 hours, Schroeder's 23 men worked with the desperate efficiency of soldiers who understood that their survival depended on completing an impossible task. They used the 1 operational recovery vehicle available to them, a half-track with a winch, to drag the disabled Panthers into position. The work was brutal. Each Panther weighed 45 tons. Moving them even a few hundred meters required cables, pulleys, and the kind of improvisation that separated experienced mechanics from dead ones. The first Panther, the one with the seized final drive, was dragged directly onto the road, positioned at an angle with its frontal armor facing the northern approach and its gun covering the killing zone. Schroeder personally siphoned diesel from 3 other Panthers to fill its fuel tanks. He assigned his best gunner, a veteran named Otto, who had crewed Panthers in Normandy, to command this vehicle. The second roadblock Panther was positioned 50 meters behind the first, offset to the right, so its gun could engage targets that bypassed the first vehicle. This one had suffered an engine fire but was otherwise intact. Schroeder filled its tanks as well and assigned another veteran crew. The remaining 4 Panthers were positioned on the eastern slope. 2 were placed in hull-down positions, only their turrets visible from the road. Their guns manually traversed to cover the approach. These tanks had no fuel, no working engines, and their turrets could not be moved once positioned. But from the road, they would look like perfectly positioned fire support. The last 2 Panthers, both completely non-functional, were placed 200 meters back as a reserve position. Schroeder had no illusions that they would contribute to the battle, but from a distance, an American commander might see 6 Panthers in defensive positions and calculate the odds differently. While the tanks were being positioned, Schroeder sent teams to prepare the surrounding terrain. Using the few mines available, they created small minefields at the approaches to the position, marked only in the rudimentary maps Schroeder sketched by hand. They placed logs across the road to force any advancing vehicles to slow down. They prepared fighting positions for the mechanics who would serve as infantry, giving them firing lines that interlocked with the Panther guns. And then Schroeder addressed the most critical problem, the deception itself. The Americans had to believe these were operational tanks with full crews, not disabled wrecks manned by mechanics. That meant radio discipline, because American radio intercept units listened constantly for German tactical communications. It meant visible activity that suggested preparation rather than desperation. Most importantly, it meant that when the Americans arrived, the response had to be immediate and overwhelming, because nothing revealed weakness faster than hesitation. By early afternoon, the position was as ready as it would ever be. 2 Panthers with operational guns and full fuel tanks dominated the roadblock. 4 more Panthers, their guns carefully positioned, created the appearance of a prepared defensive position. 23 men with rifles, 3 Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and 2 machine guns salvaged from disabled vehicles covered the infantry approaches. And in the center of it all, Hauptmann Werner Schroeder sat in the commander's position of the lead Panther, his throat microphone connected to the tank's radio, his eyes on the northern horizon, waiting. The waiting was the worst part. Schroeder had time to think about the absurdity of his situation. He was a maintenance officer, trained to repair vehicles, not fight them. His men were mechanics, not panzer grenadiers. They were equipped with disabled tanks held together by improvisation and desperation. And they were supposed to stop an American armored force that, by all reports, included experienced Sherman tank crews supported by artillery and air power. The mathematics of the situation were simple. A Panther's 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at any combat range. But Shermans had several decisive advantages. They were reliable, they were numerous, and their crews had been training and fighting together for months. The 4th Armored Division was one of the most effective American formations in Europe, commanded by Major General John Wood, known to his men as Tiger Jack for his aggressive tactics. His tank commanders did not simply advance down roads hoping for the best. They scouted, they flanked, they used terrain. If the Americans approached carefully, if they sent infantry to probe the position, if they called in artillery or airstrikes, Schroeder's improvised defense would collapse within minutes. The disabled Panthers would be revealed for what they were, immobile wrecks that posed no real threat. His men would be overrun or forced to surrender. But if the Americans were in a hurry, if they expected the road to be open, if they encountered unexpected resistance from what appeared to be a prepared Panther position, they might hesitate. They might call for support. They might take time to organize a proper attack. And time was all Schroeder needed to give his side. Time for the main German force to stabilize their attack. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Time for the broader counteroffensive to succeed or fail on its own merits. At 1600 hours, the sound of engines carried across the autumn fields from the north. Schroeder raised his binoculars and watched as the lead elements of an American column appeared on the horizon. Sherman tanks, moving at speed down the farm road, their commanders confident in their path. Schroeder counted 6 Shermans in the lead element, moving in a column formation that suggested they did not expect serious opposition. Behind them, he could see half-tracks carrying infantry, and further back, the telltale shapes of more armor. He keyed his radio and spoke calmly to Otto in the 1st Panther's gunner position. Range 800 meters. Lead tank. Wait for my command. Remember, 1 shot, 1 kill. Make it count. Otto's voice came back steady. Understood, Hauptmann. Target acquired. The American column continued forward, closing the range. 700 meters, 600. Schroeder waited, watching through the binoculars, his finger hovering over the radio transmit button. Everything depended on the next 30 seconds. If the Americans saw the trap before it was sprung, they would deploy, flank, overwhelm. If Schroeder's timing was perfect, if Otto's shot was true, if the deception held, 500 meters. Fire, Schroeder said. The Panther's 75mm gun spoke with a crack that shattered the autumn afternoon. The armor-piercing round crossed 500 meters in less than a second. striking the lead Sherman on its frontal armor at the junction between the hull and turret. The penetration was catastrophic. The Sherman's ammunition stowed in the sponsons ignited in a fireball that erupted through every hatch, transforming the tank into a pyre before its crew could react. The effect on the American column was immediate. The second Sherman slewed sideways, its commander trying desperately to locate the source of the fire. The third tank in line began reversing, its engine roaring. The half-tracks carrying infantry scattered off the road, their passengers diving for whatever cover the French farmland offered. "Second Panther, fire at will," Schroeder commanded. The second roadblock Panther, crewed by a veteran named Dieter who had fought at Caen, engaged the second Sherman. His shot struck low, hitting the Sherman's lower glacis plate and ricocheting upward into the hull. The American tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine deck. 2 Shermans destroyed in 10 seconds. From the American perspective, they had driven directly into a prepared Panther ambush. They could not know that only 2 of the 6 Panthers they now faced had operational guns. They could not know that those guns could not move to engage new targets because the tanks themselves were immobilized. They could not know that the hull-down Panthers on the slope were empty shells positioned for show. What they knew was that 2 of their tanks were burning, that they were taking fire from multiple Panther positions, and that advancing further down this road meant driving into a killing zone dominated by the most dangerous anti-tank gun in the German arsenal. The American column fell back 300 meters and stopped. Through his binoculars, Schroeder watched officers conferring, radios being used, infantry deploying into defensive positions. The Americans were doing exactly what he had hoped, treating this as a serious defensive position that required a proper coordinated assault rather than a simple advance. Lieutenant Friedhelm, crouched beside Schroeder in the disabled Panther's turret, allowed himself a cautious smile. "They're stopping. They think we're a full defensive line." "For now," Schroeder said. "But they'll probe our position. They'll send infantry forward. When they discover our Panthers cannot traverse to engage flanking movements, they'll know something is wrong." He keyed his radio to the infantry positions. "Klaus, when they come with infantry, you must make them believe every approach is covered. Use the machine guns sparingly. Make them think you have more firepower than you do." Klaus's voice came back with gallows humor. "So lie convincingly while being shot at. I trained for this in mechanic school." The American response came 20 minutes later. Artillery. Schroeder heard the distant thunder of guns firing, then the distinctive whistle of shells in flight. "Take cover," he shouted, dropping into the Panther's hull and pulling the hatch closed. The first barrage landed 200 meters long, the shells impacting in the woods behind their position. The Americans were ranging their fire, walking the shells toward the target. The second barrage was closer. Shells impacted 50 meters from the lead Panther, throwing up geysers of earth and stone. The third barrage found its mark. A 105mm shell struck the ground 5 meters from Schroeder's Panther, the concussion slamming him against the turret wall. Another shell hit the second roadblock Panther directly on its engine deck, penetrating the thin top armor and detonating inside the engine compartment. The fuel Schroeder had so carefully siphoned ignited in a massive fireball. "Dieter, get out!" Schroeder screamed into the radio. He watched through the vision port as the crew of the second Panther abandoned their vehicle, men on fire scrambling from the hatches. 2 made it clear. Dieter did not. The Panther burned with the peculiar intensity of diesel fuel mixed with oil and ammunition, black smoke rising in a column that could be seen for kilometers. 1 operational Panther remained, Schroeder's gun. The Americans had knocked out what they believed was 1 defensive position. They would assume more remained functional. The deception still held, but barely. The artillery barrage continued for 10 minutes, a methodical pounding designed to suppress the defenders and destroy their fighting positions. Schroeder and Otto remained in their Panther, enduring the concussions, the near misses, the terror of waiting for the shell that would penetrate their armor and kill them instantly. The mechanics in their infantry positions suffered worse. 2 were killed by shell fragments. 3 more were wounded badly enough that the medic, working in a crater behind the disabled Panthers, could do little more than apply pressure bandages and pray. When the artillery finally stopped, Schroeder's ears rang in the sudden silence. He raised his head cautiously, peering through the commander's cupola. The American column was advancing again, but this time with infantry in the lead. He counted perhaps 40 soldiers moving in dispersed formation, using the terrain for cover, advancing in bounds while others provided covering fire. Behind them, 3 Shermans moved slowly, their guns trained on the suspected Panther positions. "They're coming with combined arms," Schroeder told Otto. "We engage the tanks. Klaus engages the infantry. Make every shot count because we won't get many." The American infantry reached the minefield first. Schroeder heard the detonations, saw men thrown into the air by the explosions. The advance faltered as soldiers went to ground, confused by casualties they had not expected. In that moment of hesitation, Klaus opened fire with the salvaged machine guns, raking the American positions with carefully aimed bursts. The Americans returned fire with overwhelming volume. Rifles, machine guns, and the heavier 50-caliber machine guns mounted on the Shermans poured rounds into the German positions. Klaus's machine gun teams was silenced immediately. The 2-man crew cut down before they could relocate. The other team kept firing, moving after each burst, using the technique they had learned fighting the Soviets: shoot and move, never stay in one place long enough to become a target. The Shermans behind the infantry began firing high-explosive shells at the suspected German positions. One round hit the hull-down Panther on the slope, the non-functional decoy that Schroeder had positioned for Schützanisch for show. The shell penetrated the side armor and detonated inside the empty turret. To the Americans, this would look like another kill, another Panther destroyed. In reality, it made no difference because that Panther had never been a threat. But the Americans did not know that. They knew they were attacking a position that had already cost them 2 tanks and several killed and wounded. They knew they were facing Panthers, tanks that outgunned and out-armored their Shermans at any reasonable combat range. And they knew that despite their artillery and their infantry assault, the defensive position appeared to still be functioning. Schroeder watched the American advance through his optics, waiting for the right moment. One Sherman was moving faster than the others, its commander perhaps more aggressive or simply less cautious. It pulled ahead of the infantry screen, advancing to 400 meters from Schroeder's position. "Otto, lead Sherman, range 400, fire when ready." "Identified," Otto replied. There was a pause while he refined his aim, compensating for range and the slight crosswind. Then, "Firing." The Panther gun roared. The shot struck the Sherman on its turret mantlet, the weakest point of the frontal armor. The round punched through and detonated the ammunition stored beside the gun. The turret lifted off the hull in the characteristic catastrophic kill that American tankers had learned to fear. It landed upside down, 5 meters from the burning hull. 3 American tanks destroyed. The assault stalled again. Schroeder could see the remaining Shermans reversing, their commanders unwilling to advance further into what appeared to be an exceptionally dangerous defensive position. The infantry, without tank support, went to ground and stayed there. And then Schroeder heard the sound that every German soldier in France had learned to fear, the distinctive growl of American fighter bombers. He looked up and saw them circling at 3,000 meters, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 19th Tactical Air Command. They had been called in to deal with the Panthers that the ground forces could not overcome. "Everyone into cover," Schroeder ordered. He and Otto abandoned the Panther, running for the nearest crater. The mechanics scattered, diving into foxholes and depressions. Lieutenant Friedhelm, who had never experienced an air attack, stood frozen until Klaus tackled him bodily and dragged him into a ditch. The thunderbolts came down one at a time, diving from altitude with their engines screaming. The first fighter released its payload at 1,000 meters, 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. 4 missed. 3 hit the ground near the disabled Panthers, throwing up massive explosions. 1 rocket struck Schroeder's Panther, the tank he had just evacuated, hitting the turret roof and penetrating into the crew compartment. The explosion blew the hatches off and set the remaining ammunition on fire. The second Thunderbolt strafed with its 850 caliber machine guns, the heavy rounds chewing through the thin top armor of the Panthers, destroying optics and external equipment. The third and fourth aircraft repeated the rocket attacks, methodically working over each disabled Panther, until all 6 were burning or holed beyond any possibility of repair. Schroeder lay in his crater, covering his head while the earth shook and debris rained down around him. When the Thunderbolts finally departed, climbing back to altitude and circling to assess their work, he raised his head and looked at what remained of his position. All 6 Panthers were destroyed. 2 were burning fiercely. The others sat with holes punched through their armor, their turrets askew, clearly beyond any hope of recovery. The carefully prepared defensive position was a smoking ruin. Of his 23 men, he could see perhaps 15 still moving. The rest were dead or too badly wounded to continue fighting. The deception was over. The Americans would surely advance now, overwhelming the handful of mechanics with rifles who remained. Schroeder checked his pistol, chambered a round, and prepared to sell his life as expensively as possible. But the American advance did not come. Instead, through the smoke and confusion, Schroeder heard the sound of engines moving away from his position rather than toward it. He climbed carefully to the lip of the crater and looked north through his binoculars. The American column was withdrawing. The Shermans were pulling back. The infantry was boarding their half-tracks. They were leaving. Lieutenant Friedhelm crawled up beside him, his uniform filthy, his face blackened by smoke. "Why are they retreating? They destroyed our tanks. They could overrun us in minutes." Schroeder lowered his binoculars and began to laugh, a sound that bordered on hysteria. Because they believed they fought a real battle. They destroyed 6 Panthers, killed or wounded perhaps half our force, and lost 3 tanks doing it. From their perspective, this was a costly victory. They need to reorganize, resupply, coordinate with their higher headquarters before continuing their advance. "So we won?" "We survived," Schroeder corrected, which was the only victory available to us. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The aftermath of the engagement revealed the full scope of what had occurred. Schroeder's improvised defense had held the American advance for approximately 3 hours. In that time, the main body of the 113th Panzer Brigade had used the delay to reposition their forces and establish a proper defensive line further east. The American breakthrough that Schroeder had been ordered to prevent never materialized, not because he had stopped it, but because he had delayed it long enough for the broader tactical situation to change. The cost had been severe. Of Schroeder's 23 men, 7 were dead and 9 wounded. All 6 Panthers were total losses, destroyed by American air power after they had already been disabled by mechanical failure. The roadblock position itself was a cratered wasteland, marked by burned-out tanks and the debris of battle. But Oberst von Heydebreck, when he visited the position that evening after the American withdrawal, saw something different. He saw a maintenance officer who had been ordered to hold an impossible position with inadequate resources and who had somehow succeeded. He saw mechanics who had fought like infantry. He saw disabled tanks that had been transformed, however briefly, into a defensive position, credible enough to stop an American armored column. "How did you do it, Hauptmann?" von Heydebreck asked, walking among the destroyed Panthers. Schroeder, exhausted beyond measure, gestured at the wreckage. I positioned the two functional Panthers to maximize their fields of fire. I placed the disabled ones where they would appear to be part of a prepared defense. I relied on the Americans not knowing that most of my tanks could not move or fight, and I prayed that when they discovered the truth, it would be too late for them to exploit it. Von Heidebrecht nodded slowly. Improvisation, the only skill that matters when everything else fails. He looked at the burned Panthers, at the young lieutenant who sat shaking in the aftermath of his first combat, at the mechanics who were tenderly loading their dead comrades onto a truck for burial. I am recommending you and your men for recognition. What you did here today was not in any tactical manual, but it may have saved this brigade from encirclement. Schroeder did not feel heroic. He felt numb and sick and grateful to be alive. The Panthers failed, Herr Oberst. Every single one broke down before they could contribute to the offensive. Yes, von Heidebrecht agreed. And yet, in failing, they still served their purpose. Sometimes survival is a form of victory, Hauptmann. Remember that. The Battle of Aricourt continued for another 10 days. The German counteroffensive, which had begun with such hope on September 18th, gradually collapsed under the weight of American air power, superior tactics, and the chronic mechanical problems that plagued the newly formed Panzer brigades. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns that the 5th Panzer Army committed to the battle, only 62 remained operational by the end of September. The Americans lost 48 tanks and destroyed or damaged 200 German armored vehicles. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had arrived in France with 45 brand-new Panthers, reported only 12 operational tanks by September 25th. The rest had been destroyed in combat or, more commonly, had broken down and been abandoned when their crews could not repair them under fire. The brigade itself was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, its surviving elements absorbed into other units. Schroeder spent the remainder of the battle doing what he had been trained to do, attempting to recover and repair disabled vehicles under impossible conditions. He worked 20-hour days, silly eeping in craters beside the tanks he was trying to save, eating cold rations when he remembered to eat at all. Most of the vehicles he worked on could not be saved. The combination of mechanical failure and combat damage was simply too severe, but occasionally he succeeded. A tank with a thrown track could be repaired if the suspension was intact. A Panther with a damaged final drive could have the component replaced if replacement parts could be found and if there was time to do the work. These small victories, these individual tanks returned to service, were all that stood between the German army and complete collapse. In early October, after the Battle of Aricourt had ended in decisive American victory, Schroeder was transferred to a maintenance depot near Metz. His war continued in the workshops and repair yards, a different kind of battle fought with tools instead of weapons. He never commanded tanks in combat again, but he never forgot the morning he stood beside 6 disabled Panthers and turned mechanical failure into tactical deception. The story of Schroeder's roadblock at Aricourt exists in the shadow of larger narratives. The Battle of Aricourt is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a demonstration of American tactical superiority over German armor. The official histories note the mechanical problems that plagued the German Panthers, the poor training of their crews, the effective use of American combined arms tactics. These analyses are accurate as far as they go, but they miss the human dimension of what occurred on that farm road on September 19, 1944. They miss the improvisation that transformed 6 broken tanks into a defensive position credible enough to delay an American advance. They miss the mechanics who fought as infantry because the situation demanded it. They miss the welding torch that Schroeder used to secure tow cables to Panthers that could not move under their own power, and the tactical judgment that placed those immobile vehicles where they would do the most good. The Panther tank itself embodied the contradictions of German arms production in the final years of the war. It was, in many respects, the most capable medium tank of World War II. Its combination of firepower, armor protection, and mobility was unmatched by any Allied tank until the introduction of the Soviet IS-2 and the American Pershing, both of which arrived too late to significantly impact the war in Europe. A well-maintained Panther in the hands of an experienced crew was a formidable weapon that could dominate any battlefield engagement. But the Panther was also a victim of Germany's deteriorating industrial situation. The Allied bombing campaign against German factories meant that quality control suffered. Skilled workers were conscripted into the military and replaced by forced laborers who had no investment in the quality of their work. Critical materials like molybdenum and nickel, essential for high-strength steel alloys, became increasingly scarce, forcing compromises in metallurgy that weakened components like final drives and transmissions. The factories compensated by producing more tanks with less testing, rushing vehicles to the front before proper break-in procedures could be completed. The result was the situation Schroeder faced. Tanks that were deadly in combat but unreliable in service. Weapons that could destroy any enemy vehicle at range, but which might not reach the battlefield under their own power. The Panther brigades sent to stop Patton's advance in September 1944 exemplified this paradox. They were equipped with the best tanks Germany could produce, but those tanks were not ready for combat. Their crews were not properly trained, and the logistics system could not sustain them in extended operations. The American 4th Armored Division, by contrast, was equipped with Sherman tanks that were inferior to the Panther in almost every measurable way. The Sherman 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. Its armor was thinner, its profile was higher, and it was vulnerable to catastrophic ammunition fires that earned it the nickname Ronson among German tank crews after the cigarette lighter that lights every time. But the Sherman had decisive advantages that mattered more than raw combat capability. It was mechanically reliable, with a powertrain that could be maintained by crews with basic training. It was produced in massive numbers, with 15,000 Shermans delivered to Europe by September 1944 compared to roughly 6,000 Panthers produced during the entire war. Most importantly, it was supported by a logistics system that worked, by air power that dominated the battlefield, and by combined arms tactics that leveraged American strengths while minimizing weaknesses. The Battle of Araucourt demonstrated these realities with brutal clarity. German Panthers, when they functioned, were deadly. American Shermans, when properly employed, were victorious. The difference was not primarily technological, but systematic. Training, logistics, coordination, and the ability to sustain operations over time. Schroeder's improvised defense illustrated another reality that official histories often overlook: the role of individual initiative in military operations. The German army of World War II is often portrayed as a mechanistic force, rigidly hierarchical and inflexible. This characterization is partially accurate at the strategic level, where Hitler's insistence on holding every position and his refusal to allow tactical withdrawals led to repeated disasters. But at the tactical level, German military culture emphasized initiative and adaptation. Officers and NCOs were expected to assess situations independently and take action without waiting for detailed orders. This principle, known as Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, gave commanders like Schroeder the authority to improvise when circumstances demanded it. When he was ordered to hold a position with inadequate resources, he was not expected to simply obey and die. He was expected to find a way to accomplish the mission using whatever means were available. The means available to Schroeder were 6 disabled Panthers, 23 men, and his own knowledge of mechanics and engineering. His solution, positioning the tanks to create the appearance of a prepared defensive position while maximizing the effectiveness of the 2 Panthers that actually could fight, was not innovative in the sense of being unprecedented. German forces had used disabled vehicles as roadblocks throughout the war. The innovation was in the execution. The careful positioning of decoy tanks, the timing of the initial engagement, the coordination with his mechanics fighting as infantry. The deception worked because Schroeder understood his enemy. American tank doctrine in 1944 emphasized aggressive movement and exploitation of breakthroughs, but it also emphasized caution when encountering prepared defenses. American commanders had learned, through costly experience in Normandy and the Bocage fighting, that German anti-tank positions were lethal and required careful combined arms responses. When American reconnaissance encountered apparent Panther positions at Aricourt, they followed doctrine. They probed, they called for artillery support, they coordinated with air power. This methodical approach gave Schroeder the time he needed. Had the Americans simply charged down the road, his defense would have collapsed immediately. But by treating the disabled Panthers as a serious threat, by assuming that the defensive position was stronger than it actually was, the Americans gave Schroeder 3 hours. 3 hours during which the broader German counteroffensive could reposition. 3 hours during which reinforcements could move up. 3 hours that, while they did not change the ultimate outcome of the Battle of Aricourt, achieved the objective Schroeder had been given: hold the position at all costs. The cost was 7 dead mechanics, 9 wounded, and 6 Panthers destroyed beyond repair. These losses were insignificant in the context of a battle that destroyed entire brigades. But they were not insignificant to the men who paid them. The mechanics who died on that farm road were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were technicians who had joined the army to repair vehicles, not to fight infantry actions against American armor. They died because their officer asked them to hold an impossible position, and they trusted that he would not waste their lives without reason. That trust was the foundation of German tactical effectiveness throughout the war. Officers like Schroeder had to earn the confidence of their men through demonstrated competence and a willingness to share their risks. When Schroeder stayed in the lead Panther during the artillery barrage, when he exposed himself to observation to direct his defense, he was signaling to his men that he would not ask them to do anything he was unwilling to do himself. This leadership by example was not unique to the German army, but it was particularly emphasized in German military culture. The aftermath of Schroeder's engagement revealed the limits of individual initiative in the face of systemic collapse. The German counteroffensive at Aricourt failed not because of any lack of courage or tactical skill on the part of individual commanders, but because the underlying strategic and logistical situation was untenable. The 5th Panzer Army did not have enough fuel to sustain extended operations. It did not have air superiority, which meant that any concentration of armor invited devastating attacks by American fighter bombers. It did not have the replacement vehicles or crews to sustain losses. And critically, it did not have enough time to properly prepare the new Panzer brigades before committing them to combat. These systemic problems could not be solved by improvisation at the tactical level. Schroeder could position his disabled Panthers cleverly, but he could not fix the manufacturing defects that had disabled them in the first place. He could delay an American advance for a few hours, but he could not prevent the broader collapse of German defenses in Lorraine. His success, such as it was local and temporary. Yet these local, temporary successes mattered. They mattered to the men whose lives were saved by the delay Schroeder achieved. They mattered to the German units that used that delay to reposition and avoid encirclement. They mattered as examples of what was possible when resourceful officers refused to accept that a situation was hopeless and instead found ways to accomplish their missions with inadequate means. The welding torch that Schroeder used to secure tow cables became, in this context, a symbol of adaptation under pressure. It was not a weapon in any conventional sense, but it was a tool that allowed him to move immobile tanks into positions where they could serve a defensive purpose. The welding work itself was simple. attaching recovery points to hulls, reinforcing cable mounts, creating improvised towing connections that would hold under stress. Any trained mechanic could have done it. But the decision to use welding to create a defensive position from disabled vehicles required a different kind of thinking, the ability to see tactical possibilities in mechanical limitations. This kind of thinking was increasingly rare in the German army by late 1944. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, its officer corps depleted by years of casualties, its replacement training system unable to produce leaders of the quality needed to fight a modern war against opponents with overwhelming material superiority. The fact that Schroeder, a maintenance officer, ended up commanding a tactical defensive position was itself a symptom of the Army's deteriorating situation. Under normal circumstances, that position would have been held by infantry with proper anti-tank weapons, supported by artillery and with tanks in reserve, not as the primary defensive element. But circumstances were not normal. The German army in France in September 1944 was an army in crisis, desperately trying to prevent a complete collapse while simultaneously launching counter-offensives that its logistics could not sustain. Officers at every level were being asked to accomplish impossible tasks with inadequate resources. Most failed. Some succeeded through improvisation and luck. Schroeder's success fell somewhere between. He accomplished his immediate mission of delaying the American advance, but he could not prevent the broader failure of the German counteroffensive. The story ends not with dramatic victory, but with quiet persistence. After the war, Schroeder returned to Germany and resumed his profession as a mechanical engineer. He worked in the automotive industry, applying the skills he had learned maintaining Panther tanks to designing more reliable civilian vehicles. He rarely spoke about his war experiences, and when he did, he focused on the technical challenges rather than the combat. The roadblock at Aricourt was, to him, simply a problem that had required an engineering solution. The fact that the problem involved American tanks and that the solution had cost 7 men their lives was something he carried silently. The mechanics who survived the engagement scattered after the war. Some returned to their pre-war professions. Others found that their skills translating military maintenance experience into civilian employment. Lieutenant Friedhelm, the young liaison officer who had experienced his first combat at the roadblock, was killed 3 weeks later during the fighting around Metz. Klaus, the veteran Gefreiter who had commanded the infantry defense, survived the war and eventually emigrated to Argentina, where he worked as a mechanic in Buenos Aires until his death in 1978. The 6 Panthers that Schroeder had positioned so carefully were never recovered. They sat beside the farm road through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, rusting hulks that French farmers eventually cut up for scrap metal. By the early 1950s, no visible trace of the engagement remained. The craters had been filled, the fields replanted, the stone walls rebuilt. Only the official records preserved any memory of what had occurred there. And those records, German and American alike, tell a story of tactical engagement during a larger battle. The German reports note the delaying action fought by elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade Maintenance Company. The American reports record encountering strong Panther positions that required combined arms assaults and air support to overcome. Neither set of records captures the improvisation, the desperate calculation, the moment when a maintenance officer looked at 6 disabled tanks and decided to turn mechanical failure into tactical advantage. That moment, and others like it across thousands of battlefields, define the reality of war more accurately than strategic plans or official histories. War at the tactical level was improvisation and adaptation. Problems solved with inadequate tools, risks taken because the alternative was worse. It was mechanics fighting as infantry, disabled tanks serving as pillboxes, welding torches used to create defensive positions. It was, in the end, human beings trying to survive impossible situations through whatever means they could devise. Some succeeded, many failed, all of them, whether they wore German or American uniforms, whether they fought in Panthers or Shermans, whether they lived or died, were participants in a vast and terrible improvisation called war, where the only certain outcome was that nothing would proceed according to plan. The farm road east of Aricourt returned to its peacetime purpose, carrying French farmers to their fields, bearing no memorial to the men who fought and died there. In September 1944, the Battle of Aricourt faded into history, remembered primarily by military historians studying armored warfare and by the descendants of those who participated. The story of 6 disabled Panthers and the maintenance officer who turned them into a defensive position became a footnote, if it was remembered at all. But for the men who were there, for the mechanics who stood beside those broken tanks and decided to fight, for the American tankers who encountered what they believed was a prepared Panther position, for the soldiers on both sides who survived that afternoon, the story was not a footnote. It was the central reality of their war. Improvisation in the face of chaos, adaptation in the face of failure, survival through whatever means were available. That perhaps is the real lesson of Schroeder's roadblock. Not that cleverness defeats superior forces, because it does not. Not that individual initiative can overcome systemic failure, because it cannot. But that even in hopeless situations, human ingenuity finds ways to accomplish seemingly impossible tasks. The welding torch that secured tow cables to disabled Panthers was not a wonder weapon. It was a tool wielded by a man who understood both its capabilities and its limitations, who used it to solve a problem that had no good solution. And sometimes, that is enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.